Okay. Hello, everyone. I think we're going to start. What I want to do tonight is really just the main, not the main. One of the biggest parts of Hichot Shabbos is the is Bishul. Bishul, which means to cook, and there's so much in it. And what I really wanted to do is to start going through Bishul, and it's going to take us a while, because as we go through Bishul, we're also going to get to other things as well, because in the halachas of cooking on Shabbos, there are so many adjunct issues and adjunct spaces. So if you don't mind, we're going to take it over a number of weeks, and we'll cover as much as we can as we go through it, in order to really try and get a deeper understanding. Sometimes it'll be practical, and sometimes it'll be theoretical, because I want to try and build the building blocks of the different halachas. So having said that, I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to begin the journey into Bishul on Shabbos. Okay. Oops, got to get there properly to see all the graphics as well, not just the things. Okay, so let's start. So let's start with cooking on Shabbos. So cooking on Shabbos, which we call Bishul. Bishul is the Hebrew word for cooking, is made up of two things, two matters. The one is the Doraita, and the other one is the Rabbanan. The one is the issues that come straight out of the Torah, and the other ones are that which are later developments, which Chazal, which the rabbis felt was appropriate to add in because of various reasons. And as we go through those, we'll begin to understand it. And it's fundamentally important that we understand the difference between the Darabbanans and the Doraisas, because there are certain times, which we'll go through as we go through, where certain issues where it makes a difference whether it's a Doraisa or Darabbanan. Okay, so let's first understand the basic concept of what Bishul is. So Bishul is the malacha that prepares or improves food through seething, baking, or roasting. What it's really all about is a malacha that is a means of preparing food through heat. So the different ways of understanding it, and is that what does the heat actually do? So according to the one way of understanding it, the heat kind of like softens the food, and then the tastes start like merging within it. It creates a brand new taste. And since the brand new taste is something which is developed, so that becomes the issue of Bishul. That's the malacha. That's the creative activity. The actual heat is the thing that makes things different. And since it makes things different, that's issue. So if we understand the concept of malacha in a very basic level, malacha is the thing that you can't make changes from that which was originally developed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so when the minute you apply heat to something, we know that it changes. And if you'll remember, so the extension of Bishul, the toldas are going to be things where heat is used for other things. So for example, we have spoken about this before, but an incandescent bulb is heat, which is put onto a piece of metal, and the metal then lights, because it's so hot, it lights up. So that's also a malacha of Bishul, but we'll get to that in a while. I want to focus on the food. Okay. So the Torah law itself, okay, prohibits cooking, even if it's foods that you can eat raw. So if the cooking in any way improves it, so then it's asur. So on a simple level, obviously cold water, you can drink cold water, it's not an issue. However, when the minute you boil the water, you can use it for other purposes, and so therefore the Torah says you can't do it. But what is important to understand is that foods that are not improved by cooking, this is important because we're going to see later on, but in actual fact, maybe it might even mess the food up. So if you leave food on for too long in the oven, that might mess it up. But nonetheless, that will still be a rabbinic prohibition, and that's from the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch and from other places. And as we go through, we'll begin to understand where that goes. But let's look at the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch, or Achaim, 318 Shin Yud Chet. So Shin Yud Chet, the first halacha of Shin Yud Chet is a fascinating halacha. We're not going to look at that. We're not going to look at that because that really colors a whole discussion on malacha, which we need to look to when we start speaking about Amir al-Akum, about asking a non-Jew to do work for us. We'll look at that at another time. But so the first halacha is, but if we come to the third one, it says the following: in the same way as you're not allowed to cook with fire itself, you also can't cook. It's what we call a tolda d'or. A tolda d'or, the way the Sfaria translation explains, is that it's things that were on the fire, but are no longer on the fire. But because it's still hot, it's the heat which is caused by the fire is allowing you to cook. You can't do that. And for kogon, for example, or leshavra al sudar shulchan ba'or. So maybe you're going to take an egg and you're going to put it on a pot that's not that's hot from the fire, but it's not on the thing itself. Or maybe you're going to crack an egg over a garment that was heated by the fire. So he says, even not only that, even I feel a bit told that chamam, even when it's become hot because of the sun. For example, if you leave something outside, let's say you leave maybe a piece of tinfoil outside, and it becomes so hot because of the sun, you also can't cook on that. But that's a drabonan, as we see there. Why gezerah? That's a gezerah. That's a decree of rabbanan. Atu told the haor. Oh, sorry. It's a gezerah because of the tolda d'or, because we're worried that if you can cook like that, then you'll cook on anything that's been heated, even though it's not in the fire itself. And then it starts all the different drabbonans. You're also not lahatmina b'chol. You're not allowed to. Hatmin means to completely cover something. You're not allowed to do that in chum, in sand. Or other ways in which you would do it because of the heat that will make it hot. But to actually put an egg into the sun itself, right? So that is allowed. For example, I don't know how you would do that. I suppose in those boiling days of those 42 degrees that were in Cape Town a few weeks ago, you could do it. Or you're going to put hot water to be heated by the sun. You can do the direct heating from the sun is not a problem. So we're going to see how that manifests itself. What about, for example, a dud shemesh, a solar powered geyser? Can you use that on Shabbos? Is that okay? We're going to have to look at that. That's all part of the aspects of Bishul, which we're going to go through over the period of time that we're going to learn these for the next few weeks. So this concept is using fire or something that was heated by fire, the tol davesh. So therefore, any type of cooking that is considered to be cooking is prohibited by Torah law. So even a microwave, right? She's the Igros Moshe. That a microwave doesn't cook with heat in the normal way that fire cooks with heat, right? The microwave does a whole different process, but Rabbi Moshe says that since that's the normal way of cooking for many people today, so therefore even a microwave is a da'oraisa din of cooking on Shabbos. Okay, so the first one is, let's see if the three types of prohibitions. The first one is just to summarize. The first one is Bishul Torah law. Then there is this concept of lachtot gachalim. Gachalim are the coals. And what that means is that the Chazal said there's certain things you can't do because we're worried that you're going to stir the coal up to make it to kind of rekindle the flames. And so therefore, we have to be careful that you don't do things like that. And that manifests itself in a lot of things. I don't know if you've seen many people when they make a cholent, what they do is they take a piece of tin foil or something and they cover up the knob on the cholent pot, and that is why, in order to prevent them lachtot b'chalim, they don't stir the coals, meaning that you don't turn the knob. Is it absolutely obligatory? Well, we're going to see that how it works, where it works, and what it's all about. Okay. Then we see rabbinic enactments that forbid doing anything that resembles cooking. Now that also really manifests itself in warming things up, how we warm them up, where we warm them up. Can you use a hot tray, which we're going to see that you can use a hot tray, but if your hot tray has we spoke about this before as well, if the hot tray has a knob, so then I want you to cover that knob, and there's a lot of these things that we're going to look at. But let's start I want to look really tonight is to focus just on some basic Doraita principles. There are a number of these principles, and I want to just look at them so that when we do start speaking about them in the process of the real issues of Bishul, so then people will be aware of what they are, and therefore we can just use them as terms, and they're important terms. They're important terms in halacha, and they're important terms for us as frum Jews who are trying to engage in the concept of Shabbos to use as part of our parlance. We should be using these words when we speak about anything to do with Bishul on Shabbos. So let's start. There's Yad Soledet Bo, Ma'achal Ben Drosai, and Bishul Achal Bishul, Kli Rishon Iri, Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, and Kli Shlishi, and Hadasa. Okay, let's try and understand those. Let's start. They're also going to be ones that we're not going to do today. What we're going to we'll do that next week. The concepts of Shehiyah, Hachzora, and Atmana. Those are the Drabanans. So I'm not even going to focus on those at all today. Let's start with the Torah prohibitions. So the first is this concept of Yad Soledet Bo. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Echad Shemen ve'echad Mayim. Both Shemen, both oil, and Mayim, and water. Yad Soledet Bo Asur. If you heat it to a point, or what we call Yad Soledet Bo, then it's Asur. You're not allowed to do that. That's prohibited on Shabbos. Ein Yad Soledet Bo, but if you heat it up to the point where it's just before Yad Soledet Bo, then it's mutar. So what's the question is, like, what does this even mean? What does Yad Soledet Bo? Yad Soledet Bo, Soledet is like to move away from it, like the way they translate recoils it. So if you heat it to that point where your hand doesn't yet recoil, so then it's okay. Midoraita, not midrabanan, it's only midoraita. But Hechi Dami Yad Soledet Bo. So now that's a very nice concept. But what's the actual measurement? You're telling me Yad Soledet Bo, I might have very tough hands. My daughter might have very sensitive hands. So I'm putting it in one place, she's putting it in another. So how does it work? So it says the Gemara Amar Rachava is one of the great sages, says, Kol shekreiso shel tinok nichvet. The water is the temperature at which a baby's stomach will be scalded. So again, that has not really given us, well, it's given us a certain level of understanding. It hasn't given us a specific enough temperature. So that being the case, so we have to look towards our great sages. And our sages tell us the following. There are so many different sources. And the only way that we can go to for these sources is the more modern poskim, because the older poskim didn't have the same type of measurements as we do. So we now who have proper thermometers and what have you, so now we can start working them out. So look at these different sources. This is what the temperature is of Yad Soledet Bo. Now remember, it's a Doraita din. Since it's a Doraita din, the question is, do we go as strict as we can, or do we not go as strict as we can? The normative way of doing it would be to go as strict as one possibly can. But here again, it's just about really holding by your posek. So let's start. So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Rav Aaron Danzig. So he, Gansfried, sorry, I'm wrong. So he is writing this in Western Europe. He's not writing in Eastern Europe. So therefore, Western Europe perhaps are going to look at this. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says 40 degrees. Rav Moshe Feinstein, he's sitting in America, okay, much more modern. Not only is it much more modern, he's got a very good understanding of technology. He says 42 degrees. Rav Aaron Kotler, who's the founder of Lakewood, Gadol Sheba Gedolim, him and Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Gadol Sheba Gedolim, like really the greatest of the American Jews. They set up American Jewry into the powerful Orthodox Jewry that it is today. So he says 49 degrees. So you got this between 42 and 49 comes Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and he says 45 degrees. The highest is Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. Now, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank lived in Yerushalayim in the early 1900s, late 1800s. So he's also, but he says 50 degrees. So you can see that all of this is the temperature. We generally say around between 40 to to 45 degrees would be the temperature of Yad Soledet Bo. And Yad Soledet Bo is this temperature. You're not allowed to boil water beyond that point. And if you do, it's an Issur D'Oraita, as you're transgressing cooking from a Torah perspective. What's also important about that is that under certain circumstances, if the water is Yad Soledet Bo or above, then you can mix it with hot water or put it even into boiling water. So, for example, can you take water from your urn, which is boiling, and put it into your drying out cholent, because it's far beyond Yad Soledet Bo, and it's not going to get hotter. It's not going to reboil. It's not boiling. It's just going to continue to be at the temperature that it is. So the answer to that would be yes, that you could do such a thing. Okay, so that's Yad Soledet Bo, very important thing. Then we've got this concept called Ma'achal Ben Drosai. So what is Ma'achal Ben Drosai? So when we speak about cooking, the question is what is considered to be the point in time where the thing is considered to be cooked, so that if you cook it at that point, then you have been over Shabbos Midoraisa, right? It's a Torah prohibition. So it says the Gemara Ibailu. So they asked the question, right? What they're trying to understand what certain things were, and it comes out. Hanania, sorry, I'm going to just put it here for it starts. Hanania Omer. Hanania says, Kol shehu kamachal ben drosai, whatever is like the ma'achal ben drosai, which we'll have to understand what that means. Muta lishota al gabe kiri. You can leave it on the on top of a stove on Shabbos, even though it's not completely cooked, and even though you haven't yet moved away the coals, so that you don't come to stoke them. Why is that? Because if it's cooked kama'achal ben drosai, if it's cooked to that point of ma'achal ben drosai, the food of ben drosai, so then it's considered to be cooked enough that you're not over an Issur D'Oraisa. Now, what's fascinating is that what is this ma'achal ben drosai? So many people will say that Ben Drosai, as it seems to be quoted from the Yerushalmi, Ben Drosai was a highwayman. We're not sure if he's Jewish or not Jewish, and there's a whole lot of it. But I found an amazing concept, which I never heard of before, which I wanted to share with you. And this is the story. According to Dr. Shmuel Klein, Ben Drosai was a Tana named Rabbi Yonatan ben Dores. Dores, also known as Abba Hadros. Okay? So we don't find him except in really one place, in the Sifrei Zuta. The Sifrei Zuta is one of the midrashic works, and he's found in this place. So now this Rabbi Dr. Shmuel Klein wrote this whole essay about Ma'achal ben Drosai, and he identified him, okay, as this Rabbi Yonatan who joined the Zealots during the Great Revolt in Rome. Okay, so he was pretty hectic. Okay. He was pretty hectic, and he was very strong-willed, and he didn't respect the Romans. So what happens is we see that there's this Roman who comes, and he falls down, and as he was down, Yonatan ben Dores comes up to him, he cuts his throat, and then standing upon his dead body, he takes his sword and shook his shield with his left hand, and he made many acclamations to the Roman army, and he exulted over the dead man and jested upon the Romans. So now it's a big thing. Here we've got this man, Yonatan ben Dores. Ben Dores is a difficult word to understand, but says Rabbi Dr. Shmuel Klein that when he stood on top of the Roman soldier, that he was Doresotor. Now the word Dores is the word that we use for like a bird of prey. A bird of prey, Dores, it stomps and it scratches and pushes like that. And so therefore, he gets his name, Abba Hadoros, or Ben Dores. Why? Because people identify him as this hero who is prepared to really stand up against the Romans in such a powerful way. And then he writes the following. This Rabbi Yonatan was probably a vicious man, and to show his lust for the blood of his enemies, he would eat his food cooked only a third of the way. As an echo of his legend, such a meal became known as Ben Drosai meal, Ma'achal Ben Drosai, which is a crazy concept, and I'd never heard it before. And it's quite an interesting idea to say that he was a Tana, because the Tanoim are great sages, but he was obviously a man who felt, according to this understanding, that he needed to show people and he needed to live up to this image that he was a powerful, kind of vicious human being, and so therefore he only eats his food a third cooked, the way one to understand it, okay, and therefore that's ma'achal ben drosai. It's a third cooked, not 100% cooked. Pretty raw, but he's able to do that because he's that like this bird of prey that's able to rip off the flesh of the Romans. Okay, so that's one place, which is fascinating. I never heard it. I think it's a wonderful idea. Okay, however, the alternative one is a little bit easier. Okay, and that is from the Yerushalmi. So Professor Shama Friedman writes about this historical Ben Drosai. Okay, on the Yerushalmi, he says he was an avodah zarah. He was a non-Jewish person who served avodah zarah, right? Rashi says he was a thief. He was a Heimerman. And that he says that's just logic, not tradition. Why? Because the reason why he always never had complete food is because he was always running away from the authorities. According to the Yerushalmi, he was a person who asked and helped Rav Yochanan to remove the idolatry in the space of Eretz Yisrael at that time. But because he was always running away from authorities, he was a very contentious person. So therefore, he cooked his food to the point where he could like just eat it. Since he could just eat it, it's like barely edible, as we say here. So that becomes ma'achal ben drosai. But because it's edible, even though it's barely edible, so he was like the steak tartare expert of the time, right? Or that seared salmon, or that kind of stuff, right? Everything was raw. He would have loved sushi, I'm sure, but he was really, that's ma'achal ben drosai. Okay, so how much is this ma'achal ben drosai? What is the extent of the cooking? So if we look at the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, he says here, if you place so if you place meat on coals, okay, then if the amount of the meat is the amount of a dried fig, okay, even if it's spread in different places, is cooked, then what? Chayav, you obligate. But if it's not completely cooked, but it's cooked halfway, chayav, then you're obligated. Why? Because according to the Rambam, the half-cooked thing is the measurement of ma'achal ben drosai. So that's according to the Rambam. The Shulchan Aruch, on the other hand, it's not so clear, because the Shulchan Aruch says that you can't roast onions, eggs, meat on coals, and there's enough time for it to be roasted on both sides. So the degree of ma'achal ben drosai, which means half-cooked. However, you'll see now that the Mishnah Brura doesn't say that. The Mishnah Brura says, there are two Mishnah Bruras. We're going to look at this one first. This is from the introduction to Siman 253, and he makes an introduction. He says people don't understand it, so we need to introduce. So when we start doing this process of cooking, we're going to have to understand that whole introduction. We'll go through that. It's quite long, but we'll do it because we can, and we must learn. Im hatafshel kfarnit bashel kamachal ben drusai hu kachatzi bishul. He says if it's cooked like machal ben drusai, which is half, and then he says in brackets the Mishnah Brura v'yesh omrim keshlish bishul. Those that say not half, but a third, which is less, which is a much more machmir, much more strict opinion. So I'd have to be careful of that. And then he says, and later on in Sifkatan 38, Lamed Chet, he says, Kamachal ben drosai yesh omrim chatzi bishul, half cooked, but yesh omrim shlish bishul, and those are the say that it's a third. Shulchan Aruch, and he quotes the Shulchan Aruch that says what? Satam chatzi bishul. He says the Shulchan Aruch comes out and says it's half cooked. So now you've got a machlokes, the oraisa, as to whether or not it's half cooked or a third cooked. A third cooked is much less than half cooked. So where would you go to oraisa? You don't want to put yourself in a situation of where you could be over on Shabbos. So what do? So you would go to the third cooked rather than the half cooked. He says, however, and where things are pressing, so maybe you can be makel. You can go that it's actually half cooked. You don't have to go there a third cooked, but it's clear from this, seeing in the Mishnah Berurah, that what the Mishnah Berurah really is saying, that we should be strict and make sure that we don't cook chas chalila up to a third, because that's machal ben drusai, and then you're chayav, you're obligated on breaking of Shabbos in a doraita, from a Torah point of view. Obviously, that is not something that anybody wants to do. Okay. So we've done so far, if you remember, we've done machal ben drusai, which was the understanding of how much you can cook. And then we understood, we just go quickly up to the top there, the temperature of the concept of yad soledet. Okay, now let's look at another concept. There's a concept of ein bishul achar bishul. There is no cooking after cooking. So once you've already cooked something, you can't cook it again. And that's the general rule. Okay, so that's why you can reheat certain things on Shabbos. Now we are going to understand that this concept of ein bishul achar bishul, that there's a machloikas, a very big difference between, we've even spoken about this before, when we spoke about the reheating up the spaghetti bolognese, right? Is that there's a difference between the Sfaradim and the Ashkenazim when it comes to reheating certain things. Because if there's ein bishul achar bishul, is it a blanket statement for everything, or is it only certain things? So, for example, by the Sfaradim, they are able to reheat certain liquids, where by Ashkenazim don't reheat liquids at all. So there's certain times where there is bishul achar bishul, but that's all the rabbanon. That's not the rice. Okay. The next thing I want to look at is the different vessels. And it's very important for us to understand that, because the different vessels have different processes in which they are going to cook or not cook. So let's start. We have this beautiful fire image. So what vessels are we talking about? We've got the concept of kli rishon. Now, many people know this, but it's very important for us to go through to do chazorah, because it allows us to really reframe. Okay, so number one, a kli rishon. A kli rishon is a utensil that was heated by fire. Even, and this is important, even if it's no longer on the fire itself, it's still called a kli rishon. And because it's called a kli rishon, that's a doraita din, the doraita issues of cooking in a kli rishon. So we find that because of there's a certain level of heat that is retained within a kli rishon, that it becomes problematic. We then take that which is in the kli rishon. Let's just take an urn as the most simple thing. No, not an urn. An urn is not a good idea, because an urn stays on the fire. Let's say you have a little kettle, one of those like metal kettles that goes on the stove and is heated by fire. So it's heated by fire. When you take it off the fire, right, it's still a kli rishon. It might cool down a little bit, but it's still considered to be a kli rishon. If you take that and then you pour that, that's called irui kli rishon. And irui kli rishon is still very, very hot, and it's still, in certain circumstances, is able to cook to a certain degree. And so therefore one has to be very careful with irui kli rishon. So pouring from your urn into a cup doesn't take away from the efficacy, let's say, of the hot water onto that which is being poured. It's not as hot and not as powerful as the kli rishon itself, but it's still iru, it's still the pouring. Then once you pour from the kli rishon into another vessel, so the way the Gemara presents it is that the walls of the vessel make the water colder. Now it's not substantially colder, it's halachically colder. And since they cool it down, therefore it changes the nature of the let's call it water or the whatever it is that you've poured from the kli rishon into the kli sheni, and it changes it into not as hot and therefore not as able to cook any longer. Therefore, there are certain heterim around what you can put into a kli sheni. Then if you take from the kli sheni and you put into a kli shlishi, so into a third vessel, so that's the kli shlishi, and the kli shlishi never cooks. The Gemara is emphatic that kli sheni eina mavashal, that a second vessel doesn't cook. However, the way the Shulchan Aruch presents it and others is that there is a concept called kale bishul. Kale bishul means things that are easily cooked. And since things are easily cooked, which we're going to go into all of these things, Bezrat Hashem, over the weeks, things that are easily cooked, whilst a kli sheni is not mavashel, it doesn't cook properly, things that are easily cooked, such as tea, are, according to this opinion, would be cooked because it's so easy for it to be cooked, and so therefore we wouldn't be able to cook. So that's why you got a kli shlishi, because the kli shlishi is this third vessel that doesn't cook anything, even kale bishul, and that's why the tea we always would make in a kli shlishi. But we'll have to understand a little bit more and how it manifests itself in other ways, and we'll see that, please God. Okay. I want to just I spoke out. Okay, so we spoke about the kale bishul in a kli sheni, and a bishul does not occur in a kli sheni. It applies only to liquids or even to solid foods. A dvar gush is a solid piece, like a piece of meat. You're not allowed to put something which is kale bishul, let's say herbs and spices, directly onto a piece of meat. I mean, because then it still has a certain semblance of a kli rishon. We'll have to understand how that works as we go through. Okay. Now, the last thing that I want to look at tonight is this idea of what we call hagasa. Hagasa is stirring. Now, the whole thing of hagasa is that you can't stir when something is on the fire. So, for example, you've got your cholent pot is in the hot part of it. So while it's on the fire, can you stir it? Definitely not. You're definitely not, because according to this understanding is that the minute you stir it, what it does is encourages the cooking process. And even if it's fully cooked, right, it's problematic, but at least if it's not 100% cooked, you're never sure, right, you can violate the biblical prohibition of cooking on Shabbos. And so therefore you have to be very, very careful. The Kolbos says that midoraisa, hagasa is forbidden even if the food is fully cooked. So we have to be careful. The way the Mishnah Berurah presents it, as you can see here, is that v'kol shekain lahagis, mamish, to stir, mamish to asur. Mamish asur, it's forbidden. V'yesh chiyuv chatas b'zeh. You would bring a korban chatas. You would bring an offering for breaking Shabbos on purpose. According to what the Shulchan Aruch said. And so therefore we've seen that we have a number of these principles that of what cooking is and how it cooks and why it cooks and all these things that we need to really try to understand. So we go back right to the beginning just to look at what these principles are, that are going to be the principles that are going to stay with us and be used by us in just our way we're going to speak it through during the shir. So Yad Soledet Bo, that is the temperature, which we saw all the different opinions between 40 and 45 degrees is generally the accepted one. Around 43 is kind of like accepted one that everybody speaks about. Machal ben Drusai, we're talking about a certain minimal level of cooking to enable it to be edible. It is, by the way, quite fascinating that certain foods that used to need to be cooked are no longer cooked in that same way. I made a little bit of a joke about seared salmon, but it's interesting is that if you would sear salmon, even though it's not machal ben drusai, it's not even a third cooked, just 1, 2, 1, 2. So that would actually be an issur d'oraisa, because that's preparing it for its eating. So this, it's not always up to a third cooked or even a half cooked. Okay. And bishul achar bishul, there's no cooking after cooking, which means that we can warm up certain things and we can do certain things in the engagement. But remember, there are different types of cooking. There's cooking and there's baking and there's braaiing and all these different things. Is there bishul? Can you do, for example, baking is called afia. Is there bishul achar afia? Can you cook it after it's been baked? And the practical manifestation of that would be: can you put your challah into your kitka, into your soup bowl, and then pour soup over that from a kli rishon? So it's irui kli rishon onto a piece of challah, okay, which has been baked but it hasn't been bishul. So it's been afiyad but not bishul. That's the question: is there bishul achar afiyah? Then we spoke about the different kalim, the kli rishon, irui kli rishon, kli sheni, kli shlishi, and finally we spoke about this concept of agasa, of stirring. You can't stir the pot while it's on the fire, for sure not. Can you stir it when you've taken it off if it's still in the kli rishon, even though the kli rishon is no longer on the fire itself? These are the things that Bezrat Hashem, after a few weeks, we'll have real clarity on them. And and I'm looking forward to sharing all those things with you. So I hope I've given you a good grounding in some of these principles, and Bezrat Hashem will continue over the next few weeks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
God
Thank
bless.
you, Rabbi.
Pleasure, guys.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah.